Hi guys, thanks for coming out. We're gonna start by introducing ourselves, and then we're gonna ask you guys some questions to kind of get to know you and sort of know who our audience is. And with all of you out there, I don't know how many folks we've got online. We'll get a ballpark number here in a minute, but we're gonna keep this pretty relaxed. You guys are really far away over there, but like you're gonna be able to ask questions as we go and some things like that. We'll keep it pretty relaxed as we go. So either one of you guys want to go first and do introductions? I'll introduce myself in a moment.
Sure. Jordan Gray, and I'm the president and CIO of Honeycomb Digital. We are out of Yellow Springs, Ohio.
Nate Souter, representing Fifth Third Innovation. We're a small and mighty innovation team. And then I'm also entrepreneur residence here at the Entrepreneur Center. So yeah, thanks for having me.
And I'll be, I guess, moderating this panel. My name is Rich Tile. I am the founder of a company called the Noble Foundry, which does a lot of agile coaching, agile training, agile development. So excited to be here with you guys today. To help us get started and sort of know how to answer some of these questions, can we ask a couple questions of you guys first? We have 3 of them. And really, we just want you to classify yourselves. How many of you are like early stage? And this includes the folks online, so you can, what's the name of the software? You can drop it in that software. Socio. You can drop it in Socio. How many of you are early stage and you have like an idea, maybe you haven't really started on that idea or you've like just started on it, that sort of thing? How many are in that stage? 0 in the room. Okay. How many have an idea and you've committed to it? You're like full-time committed. And how many of you are somewhere in the middle and kind of just like starting to work on it? And if I didn't ask, like, what did I miss?
Just interested.
What's that? Just interested. How many of you are just here because you're interested in the startup ecosystem? Ah, lots of hands up. All right, sweet. Is that what we got online too? Ballpark?
There's a little bit of delay online, so you're not going to get it.
All right. So you guys can throw answers our way here in a minute. All right, so great. You've told us a little bit about yourselves. I don't know if you guys want to go any deeper than that, but this session, for those that don't know, is about what does it really cost to develop an app? Like, how do you actually figure some of that stuff out? What matters when you enter into that conversation? How do you go about doing it? That sort of thing. And so we have some background in that space, and we're just trying to have a really frank discussion. And like I said, as we go, like if you have questions, raise your hand, and we'll make sure that they get asked. So first question for you guys. What is the biggest challenge that you face when working with a startup, somebody in the early startup stages? Leaders, teams, the whole deal, whole shebang.
Yeah, for sure. So my background comes primarily from the technology side of things, right? So working in innovation, before that I managed software consultancies. And we had clients whom we were the stewards of their applications, right? They came to us for obvious expertise. And we were essentially supposed to make their technology better in some fashion. And for us, the hardest thing was always making sure we understood the problem that they were actually trying to solve, right? A lot of folks, when they tell us their passion about things, they might tell us how good they are at a specific aspect of their technology or of their business, or the angle in which they approach things. But when it comes to the actual problem that they're trying to solve, and you ask a person to explain that, they start to fumble over themselves because they're excited about everything else it does and not necessarily the core function. Right?
Yeah, and I'll just echo that kind of thread. Is sometimes a startup will have an idea and they believe that once they kind of render that, then everything will fall into place. So the only thing standing between their vision coming to fruition and adoption and all this really great business reality is like you're holding them up because you haven't built it and given it back to them yet. And so there's a lot of, I'm also an occupational therapist, still licensed even though I don't practice, but there's a cognitive component or mental health issue that resolves around people who have ideas, and you have an idea and you think you're the only one that understands it. You think that if you could just get someone to do it, it's going to all be magical. There's a lot of magical thinking surrounding ideas, and trying to like kind of get people to a level where you can start engaging them and getting business requirements and kind of going through the process and explaining budgetary issues is a hard, initial step, I'd say.
Yeah, that's great. For me, if I'm going to answer some of my own questions here, I think, because we're like treating this way, a group, and they may ask me questions as we go. For me, I always see founders have to go on this like startup journey where they start in this sort of phase, and they have to accept and learn and come to a place where they're like, oh, it is going to be really hard, the building of this thing. It is really going to take a lot of time, and it is really going to take a lot of money. And I think there's I've watched a few founders go through that journey where they start with this sort of idealistic view of the world and move on from there. So super interesting, the psychological side of it. All right. Oh, yeah. Next, we got a question online. I'll repeat it if you don't have a mic, right?
This is from Jack. Is the topic only for mobile apps, or are we talking web and mobile apps?
Okay, so Jack would like to know if we're talking only mobile apps or if we're talking web and mobile apps. Did I get that right? Yeah, so in this context, we're talking all of them, like any sort of software delivery, whether it's a native app, a web app, a React Native thing, like whatever it is, we're talking all that stuff. So it's pretty broad, and regardless of what you're building, the barriers and the approaches that you might take in order to get those things built are going to be very similar. Like you're going to run into the same problems, you're going to hit the same things. So I think the topic is relevant broadly. Any disagreement?
Just an add-on to that, the more you get into specialized software for the Android or for the iOS, or if you move into the native side of things, your costs are going to go up. But still solving the application on a web app is still a challenge, still going to run you some numbers.
Great. So you guys mentioned the problem, getting the problem sort of narrowed down. What are, like, if you had to list off some things that founders need to get sorted out before they start engaging with somebody and saying, all right, like, we want to build this thing. What are some things that you would want to you'd want to have them have in place?
Yeah, for sure. So I mentioned earlier, I tend to approach things from a user experience standpoint, and the reason behind that is very intentional, right? A lot of folks have really great ideas, and they're able to articulate like what that idea is, and then they say, and if I only had an app to help me do that, right? And what building a user experience. So when you just think of, let's just use a mobile app, right, for the sake of that example. If I think about a mobile application has screens, right, that are linked together that help me do a series of tasks. So if I am a startup founder, I am founding a company to accomplish tasks. So if your tech team, let's say, or the person building your application and you as a founder are having trouble communicating, building user experiences is a way that I've gotten around that, because I could talk to a founder and say, okay, you're telling me that you want to build widgets. I'm showing you screens that I believe accomplish that. Tell me how I'm wrong, or tell me like, yeah, you nailed it. Like, let's go. It looks real. So that's how I would approach that first, anyway.
Yeah, I got so wrapped up in your answer that the exact framing of your question, I'm probably lost. But on the same point is, yeah, you can't expect your developer to solve all of your business requirement details. They can't be the subject matter expert on the implementation and rollout of it. You have to bring the business requirements to the table. And like you were saying before the meeting, we were chatting, kind of laying down those screens and just doing a little bit of homework to rough in and start bridging that communication to the development team so they can see what you're thinking. And that's communication is probably, I would say, 95% of everything that happens in programming. I don't know if you would agree with that or not, but that's where, as soon as you get that achieved between you and the founder or the whatever, pretty much the work is pretty straightforward. It's like a clear path. But getting to that moment where they understand you, that's like 95% of the effort.
Yeah, I like to say that software development, software engineering is primarily a social activity, which is contrary to what, like, the picture you probably have in your head of what software engineering looks like. You're not locked away in a closet. The more you can get folks to talk, the better off you are. So Don has a question for us.
Yeah, and maybe just to stay on this general topic, I mean, how much planning is enough, right? So in the context of a startup, never built software before, how much planning is enough before you pull developers in and
Okay.
thoughts around MVPs and things like that?
So for the folks on the online, the question is how much planning is enough? Like before we can start pursuing MVP, before we can, which means minimally viable product for those not familiar, like the smallest possible thing that you could build that would bring value. How much planning is necessary? So why don't you guys go? That's a fun question.
All right, yeah, this is an area that I have some pretty strong opinions, especially coming from UX, because when you think UX, you think about the user, right? So case point number one, there's a very cliche saying that says, in UX, you need to know your user, but by the way, you're not the user, right? So it's important to know how your customers are going to use it. What I think about though is when I'm planning for an application, I'm planning to go to development. You start with a thesis, right? That thesis is, I believe with a piece of technology, I'm going to be able to run my business better, right? When we start planning those things, I would be hesitant to start just asking people, if I build this, will you use it? Because people are like nice, right? People, you share an idea with someone and they want to share in that positivity. They're not going to be like, no, that's a stupid idea, right? But maybe they should. So where I would really start with this is when you have a thesis, I would, or an idea of what a good application or a good business model could be to run your business. I would try to back that up with more quantitative data rather than qualitative data. And the reason that you do that is if you can prove an idea based on quantitative data, so data that exists via existing research reports, competitive reports, things like this, you'll be able to approach folks like the Entrepreneur Center, for instance, right? So shameless plug, obvious and shameless plug for the Entrepreneur Center, or angel investors, or someone that isn't, Aunt Jane or your sister, and be able to prove a point, right? Then, while you're planning, going into the user requirement side of things, right? So understanding who all of the users are that use your application, whether it's an end user or a company admin, right? Listing those users out and what they need to accomplish in the application. Then build the user experience, then get your qualitative data, right? And I would say at that point you've done enough.
All right, before you go, would you mind, I think you've got an example about something like that. I think you can share it, I don't know, but you shared one when we met last week or whenever.
Yeah,
sure. You know what I'm talking about? Laundry something?
Yeah, and a big success on, I believe it was on this stage last night. So through the Entrepreneur Center, the mantra there is no startup left behind, right? So if you are from the Dayton area or you reside in the Dayton area and you want to launch a company in Dayton, you need to get in touch with us because we want to have your back and get as passionate about what you're as passionate about yourself. So there is a company that came to us. They're called Tumbled, and it's two individuals that actually pitched at the pitch competition yesterday and were one of the winners. Young guys. Miami University graduates, much like yourself, right?
That's good.
And they entered with an idea, right? They had a real problem. They had a thesis that they could solve it. They'd seen this done in other big cities on wash and fold services, right? So we're pretty familiar with this. Like, I need my laundry washed. I don't have a washer and dryer. There must be people like this that need this. And the way that they originally pitched to the Entrepreneur Center was as if they wanted to create a mobile app, right? There's no mobile app for wash and fold services. We're like, that's super dope, right? You guys seem like smart individuals. When we started to dig into the company, when they got accepted into what we called like the Prospect Academy. So in other words, your tech's not ready yet. You're not ready to essentially produce metrics. But we want to observe you because we like you guys. And I'm foundationally positive that these guys they're approaching technology kind of like Domino's in my mind. Like Domino's is not a pizza company. Domino's is a tech company that sells pizzas, right? These guys are a tech company that is going to do laundry, but they're going to do so much more than that. Like these guys have that talent, that drive. And in some of our early conversations, they weren't married to their own id, so to speak, right? Like they weren't all about themselves and like, no, we can't be successful without an application. It was, we want to do business. We like being entrepreneurs. Like help guide us. And there's a big difference between guidance and advice here, right? Advice is, I've listened to you, and I think you need to change something about yourself, right? Guidance is, yeah, let's look at all your possible options, and then you make the best decision, and I'm going to trust that you're going to make the best decision and have your back, right? Like that's the nature of the Entrepreneur Center. So as these guys were laying out their requirements, what we realized is, and in deciding if they were going to create a web application or native mobile applications, we had to start looking at what the application actually needed to do, right? And we didn't really know, right? We knew that we wanted to offer wash and fold services, but at what price point? Is this going to be a subscription model, a one-off model, a per pound model? Like, I don't know how much my laundry weighs, right? It's like, how am I going to know how much this is going to cost? And what I told, the guys is, what if we start looking at ways we can just start beating the streets now, right? Because it was going to take a long time to get an application out. We didn't really know the foundation that the application needed to do, especially on a revenue production basis. So I was like, what if you guys just started working? And then they go, okay, right? Like, what a great team to mentor. But so they started printing out flyers. They started looking at apartment complexes they could go to, catering companies that they could go to, and they just started beating the streets. And what they realized was their original thought process behind a revenue model wasn't going to work based on the way that they even could run their business, right? Their pre-revenue form. And so they just started doing the work. And then from that learning, now they have the quantitative data. Now we can create an application that solves that problem. And I wish everyone approached it that way.
Yeah. What I love about that story is they walked into the software part of this knowing that they were going to be successful with the software part. They were just scaling something that they couldn't figure out how to scale given what they had. So I'm gonna move on to the next question. You can answer first. But I want to tell a quick story as part of this question and sort of rewind us here because we got into like the right way to go about this. But let me rewind to this question. 15 years ago, I was working at P&G. I walked into a room with a big, giant conference room table for my first meeting with this team of people from an ad agency somewhere in New York, something, and like everybody's vice president, something. I'm meeting these people for the first time, and I walk in and I sit down, and within 3 minutes, no exaggeration, within 3, and not throwing P&G under the bus, this was a while ago, within 3 minutes, somebody turned to me and said, how long is it going to take us to build this website? And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Like, the technology, like, we don't understand the technology. So I'm curious, how would you have answered that question?
Yeah, and that's a great, it's a very common problem. We've been, kind of get a little more background on myself, about 22 years doing web application development, in the last 4 years or more into the mobile side very heavily. But it's always been true that when a customer shows up, they're asking you how much, and then they're asking you why isn't it finished, and they haven't even given you content, they haven't given you anything. Our process back in the day when we started doing this a lot was measure twice, cut once process. So we do a full discovery where we drain their brain of everything that they know about their business, and then we take that and we translate that into a blueprint or a wireframe. That's our measuring twice. And then we basically, only then can you really quote the project like at the first real pass. Anything else is really someone's going to lose. So either the developer is going to lose very heavily or the business is going to lose very heavily if you just quote it high. So, being able to articulate and blueprint the crud out of it is really key to make sure that everybody's on the same page. You figure out a lot more pieces, and then also you figure out what you can carve out of that story and make, the MVP, kind of distill it down. Well, we just need this one. People need to buy, control, and then sell something. Like, just zero in on that one thing, carve everything down. You can requote that, and you can show them like, hey, the MVP is going to cost you this. Phase 2 is this. Phase 3 is. You can start phasing it for them. That's the way I would approach it.
Great, thanks. What about you?
Yeah, there was a example that I heard from pick your huge multinational company. I don't remember who it was at this point, and they were doing a huge re-platform, right? But they were going to use a third-party platform to bring it in. And what the vendor told them was, based on this multi-million-dollar re-platform, if you're not willing to invest 10% of your total budget to validate that it's the right solution for your problem, then maybe you shouldn't do it, right? And I think that goes into the startup world as well as, I've been an entrepreneur before, and it's scary to think that you could be wrong because you've put everything in you into building kind of this idea in this business. And it's not necessarily about failing quickly, right? Like, it's too easy to just say like I want to fail quickly. What you really want to do is understand where you're doing it wrong and like fix it really fast, right? And that's a way that you can do it is through UX, right? Through that measuring twice aspect of things.
All right, so we've talked a little bit about like the wrong way to go about it, right? Like don't start with that question, how long is it going to take to build it, all those sorts of things. Let's talk now about the right way. Like what's the right way to go about it? You've talked a lot about UX for sure, but if you could start by walking us through, like somebody comes and says, I've got this idea, and you want to minimize cost, you want to minimize time to learning, you want to minimize, there are two measures that are really interesting to think about. One is time to learning, the other is time to dollars. Like if you can minimize those measures, you can get to something interesting sooner. So you want to think about walking that path. Like what's the ideal path? You can't camp out in design world. You got to start getting learnings out there. So
Can
what
I
do you
ask
got?
you a question about the scenario that we're describing?
Sure. Did I skip you?
No, do the people have
Oh, this
do
question,
the people
got it.
have money? Do they have a budget? Do they have
No.
any kind of
This whole
funding?
session is like do it on no dollars.
Nothing?
So I mean,
Okay.
they have a little bit of money.
Okay, well, let's go with the no money.
Yeah.
The most expensive way to do it, obviously, is to quote this thing out and go full bore, fire up a team, go through these discovery processes and so forth. But assuming you don't have that cash, one of the best ways that if you have someone that you're working with on a web application level, even if you're headed to a mobile app, if you have your friend that can do a web app, and they're familiar with a lot of these guys and gals will build and tinker and have all kinds of things in their toolkit. And if you're able to connect and network and find someone that's got something kind of like not too far away from what you're trying to build, I think that you could actually throw a little bit of money towards someone who has some of these components, and they probably did it on their own, like for free for themselves and experimenting. Give them a little bit of money to kind of finish the prototype or wrap something around and make it tangible so that you can start telling your story more clearly. So, I would really try to start getting actual, and this is assuming that there's a real business model, there's a real customer, there's someone who will really buy it. Otherwise, what we were talking about before is any MVP that you spend $500, $1,000, $10,000 on, if it never gets used, is too expensive. So that's really the other part of the story.
Yeah. Go ahead. What do you got?
Let's have you restate the question so I'm answering the right thing.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the ways that it's wrong to go about it, but like if you had basically no money and you were starting to build an app from the very beginning, how would you go about, like how would you advise everybody in this room to go about building the app? They've only got so much time.
Yeah, so the first thing that I would do is be honest with yourself on if you are building an application or if you are building a feature, right? Because an application is going to take a lot more things. So everything from authentication, right? So you're going to have to write, like if you ever wonder how hard an application is to build, just look at, follow the sign-on flow for any application that you download, let's say, right? Because it's cumbersome, because security and identity is a thing, and there are bad people in the world, right? On the flip side, right, if you are doing e-commerce, if you are selling something, look at how the checkout process works, right? How does your refund policy work akin to what is readily available through a platform? And think if you were going to develop that from scratch. So going back to my first statement on understand if you are a feature or a real, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, how do they get a handle on what that's going to cost though?
Yeah, and that's my whole thought, right? So if you think about the types of data or the types of products that need to be listed on your application that you're creating, the goal is to understand, what am I working toward? And then there's a term called backcasting. Like if I know where I'm going, I can figure out where I need to start now to be able to get there, right? And if you ever want a really cool video to look at, it was in the 80s or 90s, Apple put out a video on what effectively became the iPad, right? And it was a promotional video. It looks like an 80s or early 90s, late 80s. It might even be before that. But what they ended up doing was they set the vision for what they were really going for, and they backcasted into this is what we can do today, to be able to get there in the future. And quite obviously, they launched a lot of products along the way. But that I'm going kind of around the point to answer your question. But if you know where you're going, then you can get started. Someone here was talking about boats and sails, right? Was it you in our first conversation?
A mariner statement,
Yeah.
Yeah, when you don't know where you're going, no wind is favorable is an old mariner statement.
Yeah, it's brilliant, right? So given that, right? So if you know if you're a product or if you are a feature for someone else, you're going to know if your end goal is to scale, if your end goal is to get it to a point to be acquired, right? And kind of make an early exit. There are existing platforms that can help you do a lot, right? So if you need to sell things, you can spin up a Shopify account in like 3 days, right? You don't need anything necessarily fancy. Sometimes it is obviously trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, right? Depending on what you offer and how you need to do that service, but that stuff is possible. A lot of existing applications, like let's say you are building a feature off of an existing application, a lot of these big companies have made accessible their APIs, right? And so, a quick definition of an API is, think about any time you log into an application and it allows you to sign in through Facebook, right? So they're using existing services through Facebook to authenticate who you are, effectively, right? That's done via their services that they're offering, essentially publicly. So if you're trying to build a feature and you see it as a bolt-on product, there's a chance that the company that you're trying to create those features for, whether it's analytics on Stripe accounts or hiring processes off of LinkedIn, things like this. There are ways that you can get a head start and know how that data is going to go through your system. The other side that I will say is when you're thinking about, do I need a web app or do I need a native app? To me, this is where this comes in, right? The way that I would put this simply is if there are things your users need to do offline, you might think about going native app, right? So think about games. Like there are some games that you can play offline without an internet connection, but if you don't have an internet connection, you can't go to a website. So pretty simple there. And also think, and Jason alluded to this earlier, with each new platform offering that you have, that's another code base that you have to maintain. And if you are a 1 to even 10 person shop, maintaining multiple code bases might not be an option. And so quite obviously there are ways you can get around it.
Yeah. Jordan, what options do you have if somebody wants to start building something? What options do they have for starting to build? I mean, they could, I'm thinking of things like offshore, onshore, code it yourself. Can you elaborate on what options somebody might have to get started?
Yeah, so I just heard someone mentioning this earlier, this thing called Bubble. I don't know, it's out on the West Coast, that someone can prototype for a lot cheaper, a spin-up app for you. I'm not familiar.
Can you include costs, like ballpark, as you think this? Yeah, as much as you can talk about costs.
I was just hearing someone else kind of talking about that, and they were kind of commiserating or whatever, not commiserating, but admitting that they had blown tens of thousands when they should have just gone for the MVP, thin sliced, into that opportunity. But I think that there's this illusion in technology that I look at. There's a gap between here and there, and the dive and the rise again is infinite. You may never get. That's it feels like the technology is right in front of you and you can have it, but it's actually potentially an infinite distance. And I know that's kind of weird, but anyway, that's the way I think of it. Because the trickery is when you're getting going, you're like, oh no, if we could just do it, then it'll be all mine. Technology is plagued by non-inoperable systems because nobody wants to share their IP or their special idea with anyone. So we end up with isolated failures, basically, proliferating. So anyway, there's a lot of fear in calling someone up and saying, here's 5,000, do my idea. That's just pretty scary. But the reality is, it's hard to build a business. Go for the cheapest chicken and try to render it and then start telling your story and expand.
So I think part of the narrative that we're sharing here is if you walked in expecting us to go, well, it's $35,000, which I don't think anybody expected that. But if you walked in looking for numbers, there really isn't a number. There's not something that's really tangible in that way. What you have to do is try to find ways to minimize that cost to value, the dollars to value and dollars to time. And so what we're trying to do is present different ways for you to think about doing that. So we've got a question from online here. Great. I'm going to repeat that question. I'm going to try anyways. The question was, do we have any strong opinions about platform technology choices that sort of are easy and cheap to prototype on the front end, but then could maybe play the scale role on the back end? If you think about the life cycle of a startup, you got like this, you want cheap and easy up front, and as you get to the point that you've proven product market fit, then how do you scale that thing afterwards? And they're looking for strong opinions on technologies that do that well. I'm curious for answers. Jordan's up first.
I'll just say strong opinion because this is what we're doing for one of our larger mobile app clients. Company has a business, it's a platform, social network platform called ArcNet, and they wanted to rapidly build this, but it wasn't clear all the components. So we went with React Native to be able to build in iOS and Android and keep those two platforms in tow. But truth be told, we wanted to also do web in the future, but we didn't want to do three things at once. We wanted to do two things at once, and React Native covers both of those rather than trying to go native code for each of them and have a web app. We would die iterating, is my belief. So we've been, for 2.5 years, building them out in React Native, and the React Native sits across both. So that kind of gives, and I know that the example that was given was a little bit smaller components, but I'll share that for the mobile side. And then we also have this customer wanting augmented reality in the app. And there again, too, you could go with ArcCore and ArcKit for each of the platforms, but there's a cheap chicken, open source, not well super supported Viral Media, which is a bridge, just like React Native is a bridge. And we're just doing enough of the AR right now to kind of keep the MVP moving forward, knowing that when there's more funding, we're going to go in deep and do more native. So go with the cheapest thing that you can do across any platform to show your story, I'd say. Test it out. And I'll just say also, in technology, if you could make it happen, it's working. So like that's a good deal. You can always upgrade that.
Yeah, do you want to answer?
I was curious if you have an opinion.
Oh, yeah, I do have an opinion. I would push back on the question, honestly. I think that when you try to accomplish both of those things at the same time, you're asking quite a bit of your stack and quite a bit of your engineering team. I would propose that what you do is you build a product as cheap and fast as you can, and if you do something that works, that people want, you'll find the money to deliver it the rest of the way, and so then build your scale-up product. So I wouldn't worry about, I'd find the cheap and fast platform, which these guys who are probably more technical than I am may have an opinion on that. And yeah, so you have an opinion on this, the overall question, or mine?
Yeah, I'll branch off here. I'm glad I let him talk. That was good. I would have been embarrassed with my answer, I think. So I'm going to change my tune, I guess. Yeah, I think, to branch off of exactly what you said, I think that it's important for early stage startups to know if on day one, right, your application is launched, do people need to know about you, or do you need revenue? Because if you build a really cool application and no one knows about you, you're not going to get revenue, right? But there are ways that you can bootstrap, right, which is kind of what we're talking about, to get data and to use that money toward blasting your name out there, right? Whether it's social media platform ads that have been shown to work over time, or elsewhere. So that piggybacks on what you were saying is, do you need revenue or do you need data? Because you can do one of those pretty quickly. If you focus on both, I need revenue and I need data or marketing or people to know me, it gets infinitely more expensive, right? As far as platforms go, so from a validation and an easy way to update, I'm a huge fan of Sketch, if you can draw. And the reason is Sketch it's easy to learn because everything is an object, right? Like if I draw a box, I can like grab that box and move it around, and it's pretty intuitive to quickly draw screens. There's a lot of like templates based on the type of device that you're building on. But the cool thing there is it's immediately integrated with Envision app. And what Envision can help you do is create those clickable demos to be able to do research, user research, market research, or even just feel it, right? Now, quite obviously, there's a consequence in making it look real. Is sometimes stakeholders think that it is real, and there's nothing that exists behind it, right? But I know that quite obviously those two things exist. Yeah, I really like developing something for proof of concept rather than giving yourself a Rolls Royce on day one and then not be able to sell it, right? It's an interesting reason why, and I believe this is correct, but feel free to fact check me. But there is a big language amongst startup backend folks called Ruby on Rails, right? So Ruby is the language, Rails is the web framework, and even companies like Twitter were originally developed in Rails because everything is an object, right? So my handle is @insouter, right? And anytime I search for @insouter, it will list them all, and it's easily searchable and easily scalable. What they realized though is it's hard to find that much Rails talent anywhere, so they rewrote it during one of their big expansions into PHP. And what you're going to say is, well, of course, Twitter could afford that. It's like, yes, they could, because they got something out there quick, right? And they scaled quickly with Rails.
Yeah, we got a question from the audience here. I can repeat it if you just holler it.
Sure. Have either of you made like a Wizard of Oz or Soylent Green type application where you're making something that's interfacing with somebody behind the scenes as an MVP?
Yes.
Business case?
So the question for those online is, have either of you made, he's referring to a couple of techniques for getting learning and maybe even getting money, called Wizard of Oz and Soylent Green. Either of you tried, the question was, have you tried them and what have you learned? Yeah.
I'll have to pass that. I have no experience with that. It sounds like smoke and mirrors. Is that what you're saying?
I can talk about some of those. Yeah, there are a number of, what you're referring to, there are a number of concepts. Mechanical Turk is a different one. I'm most familiar with that. Wizard of Oz and Mechanical Turk are kind of similar, but like there's a book, a really great book called The Write It, one of the first books I think written on this subject, that is basically the idea behind it is that you fake it. You sell the service and you pretend like it's doing what it's supposed to be doing. One of the examples used in the book was actually a laundry example where they were selling a machine that folded your laundry for you at the laundromat. Amazing. But what was actually happening is you were throwing it into this machine, you press the button, it would like pretend to spin or something, and they would open a secret door behind it and go there. So have I done it was really the question. I'm trying to like play through.
Are you tied to Theranos?
No. I don't think. I mean, I guess I've done some of that. Don't tell anybody, but with the Noble Foundry, where like we're selling services, and you can still do it with services. Like, hey, we're putting together a program that looks like this. Are you interested in doing that? Would you sign up for a webinar? Not would you, but I'm doing a webinar that's this. Would you do that? And so it's a little bit faking it, but it's not quite in the class of what you're talking about. Like if you're building a product. So limited experience. I'm stretching it a bit, admittedly.
I don't know if this totally goes into it, but there is another startup that I get to advise that I think does something like this. So they effectively take orders online, and it looks like it's a very automated process, right? But as far as fulfillment goes, it's a very manual process. But it looks very automated, right? It's just, he's not at scale yet. It's kind of proof of concept, and he's blowing through it. But it's like order comes through, okay, I have to do this, and I have to make it look like it's coming from another piece of technology until I can afford to build that piece of technology that will allow me to come back, right? Yeah, I have seen that. As far as proof of concept goes, hey man, it's working. Right, he's going to get funded for the next, portion of his application, and so it did its job. And it's not an unethical practice because nothing's being sold to the customer that would say you are paying for this service to be automated. It's just a lot of work on his end to make sure, that the rules get baked.
Yeah, another favorite example there, just to help folks understand the point. You all have seen, take a photo. I mean, you've done this. You take a photo of the check and you deposit the check. Well, back in the day, I forget who was first to market. You may know. Whoever was first to market, this story is not about them. It's about the company that was second to market. They needed to get to market really fast. So literally, you were taking a picture and sending a picture to a person. And that person was looking at your check. And they were doing all the entering of all the data and all that behind the scenes, and that's how your deposit happened. They don't do that anymore. They've built up so that they've got natural or language recognition or OCR and all sorts of stuff like that integrated into it. So yeah, I have stories, no examples.
I think that's great though, because I mean, what we always like our favorite applications, especially when I was in consulting, are the ones where businesses are being run in Excel, right? Because we know that that business works. Now we just need to create technology that allows you to do something else rather than what that Excel spreadsheet is doing, right? So it's like operational efficiency. So it's like it's already been proven that you need it. You're not doing anything that you're not used to doing. You're creating a piece of technology that helps you run your business. And that's interesting because people assume that all entrepreneurs need to be straight up inventors, let's call it, right? Or the technology advancement comes through invention. And typically what happens, is you have a process that currently works and you change something about that process in a meaningful way, and it ends up launching you into the next kind of sphere of entrepreneurship.
We got another question?
Yeah, so maybe with the time we've got left, kind of pivot. So should you even build it, right? So we've talked a little bit about MVPs, but I think there's probably plenty of cases where you buy versus build, and maybe some insights there as to how you make that decision.
Yeah, so the question is about, are there any insights around buy versus build choices, and maybe the overarching question of, should you build this thing at all? So what are your thoughts?
Well, the mission here today with no money, you know, I don't know what you're going to buy for no money. So if there's money available, I think you'd really have to go through some pretty serious, you know, looking under the hood to see what kind of spaghetti code or non-existent code might be there on the surface. What's that?
Human code.
Yeah. Yep. So yeah, human factor there. I think you really have to know your stuff if you're going to purchase, you know. But I think there's a lot of apps out there that are probably well built and well constructed, and they couldn't get the business off the ground, and they could be acquired, and the code base is clean, and you could pick it up for 10K, 5K from someone that just wants to offload it, and that's not nothing.
You want to add to it?
If you can go, or I can go. It doesn't
You
matter.
go first.
I think that it's extremely situational, right? Like if something exists out there, like there was a period of time where every company in the world wanted a blog because, like me, they really like to pontificate, right? Is why would you write a blog from scratch when WordPress exists and no one really even needs to know that you are bringing in WordPress into your website, right? There are other situations, though, where the buy aspect is going to prohibit your future growth, and it's going to cost you a lot more money in the long run. The nice thing about building means that, in theory, you should be building exactly what you need and nothing more, right? But that takes a lot of discipline.
A footnote. And so we were first talking about like acquiring an actual app or whatever, but let's just say you have a developer that you're working with. They may have a propensity to want to learn and build something that's really a challenge for them, and you're funding that learning experience. So for your developer to be able to leverage a service that might be $8 a month instead of building the component themselves is a huge way to buy instead of build, and bring in all those different components and daisy chain them into your success. And you're using all the infrastructure too from other people.
Yeah, I'd argue that if you can duct tape and Band-Aid something together out of Shopify and Google Forms and whatever, like that, like start there. In all sincerity, start there. If something is really solving a problem, it doesn't matter. Like, people will still buy it. Like, if you're legitimately solving a problem and the experience isn't what you envisioned it to be right now, they will actually give you money for it. And if they'll actually give you money for a crappy experience, imagine, like, what it will look like when you get to the point that like, you've got a real quality experience, the one you've got in your head. I think like, if I may, risk offending some folks, I think it just takes some patience and some ability to like go, all right, we're gonna get there, but we're gonna plot out the path to do it. So there's some maturity and some patience to like sorting out what does this look like and letting it develop over time. So yeah, encourage you to cheat and find really simple, creative ways to do that. And I think this is where the value of a team comes in, because identifying those creative things takes a team. We got another question from online.
I'm going to add a little bit to it as well.
And it's going to be embellished.
Does developer may know about, but the layperson wouldn't.
Okay, so somebody's asking if you post an app on the App Store, does it cost you money in any way? And then are there other, we'll call them hidden costs of ownership? I'll take the first question and leave the second question to you guys, because the first question's a relatively straightforward one, unless I don't know something. Apple App Store takes, back in the day, they took 30%. I assume they're still taking 30% off of every app sale on the store. Google taking money or no? They take some?
They've dropped it to 15%.
15.
If it's mid-year, you can get a $500,000 cap. They won't. There's a protection of some of your funds in
Okay.
the lower rate.
Yeah, but the more interesting question, I think, to answer there, the less straightforward one, is like, what are the hidden costs? Because there's some hidden costs for sure.
Yeah. So on the former question, there is legislation that's out there, probably California because they're the first to everything, right? That says that Apple can't force transactions to happen through the application. So in theory, if you have a website, you could affect a transaction for a service or a subscription through the company's website, enter a code on the application, and now you get those services, right? So
Yeah.
that's
just emerging this week, right?
that is this week's headline.
Yeah, and incidentally, I didn't make that part clear, but it's like every transaction. That's why you can't like rent. That's why companies don't let you rent videos or something like Amazon Prime. You can't pay for Amazon Prime Video through the Amazon Prime app. You have to go to the website to pay for it because they're not willing to give Apple the 30%. I think that still works that way.
But just to qualify that, when physical goods are exempt. Yeah, but the digital goods, to your point.
Yeah, it was more complicated. I said it was straightforward, then I flubbed it. Were you going to answer hidden costs, either of you?
I mean, there's a lot of effort in getting an actual, like, if say you have the app built, getting it like submitted to Apple it could be an inordinate amount of time, depending on challenges that come back. Some of this stuff has to do with policies that the company hasn't even thought through. You have to have updated terms of service. You have to have clarification on certain permissions and so forth. Little things that Apple might reject. They're gonna reject your app at their whim, partly, and they might pass several times, and then suddenly it'll be rejected, and then the developers are having to figure out how to resubmit that, qualify it, do some fixes. So there's actually some hidden costs in submitting and managing the app submissions and so forth. I'll just mention that as one thing.
Yeah, I want to add on to that with one other hidden cost that I think gets overlooked quite a bit, and I want to explain how it happens. When you build an app, you might think like, cool, or app, website, whatever. You build some software. When you're done with it, you might think like, cool, now we're done with it. But there's a big problem, and that is that everything that's underneath of it changes. Everybody get the iOS update today, right? Like that stuff, the stuff that it runs on is changing. All the technology underneath is changing. All the version of PHP that we're on now is different than it was, a year ago or whatever. And some of that stuff moves really, really fast. Other stuff moves more slowly. So the hidden cost I'm talking about is the cost of ownership. Like you can't just build it and then forget about it because it will not work. Potentially in a few weeks, but certainly in a few months. You're looking, if you're not like doing some kind of maintenance on it, you've got some kind of a problem on your hands. So there is this. I don't mean to be like a downer on the question, but this cost of ownership is really real. So you've got to find a way. You like buy yourself enough time, and then like later on you're gonna have to invest again. But you don't get a 3-year window on your app. It just doesn't work that way.
Can I footnote that?
Yeah.
Because as you talk, the longer we talk, if we talked about costs, it's going to keep going. The conversation is going to keep adding things. But on the point of testing your app is very expensive effort with a very highly skilled person. So you can't just have someone who barely knows about the app, kind of doing the basic functions. You have to have someone that actually is at an engineering level running iterations after iterations of scenarios. And they have to be patient because you have to go back, start a new user. Does this happen when the new user is created? Does this happen when this user is this type of user? Does it happen with this kind of a transaction? That's exhausting. And really, most often, would you say most testing doesn't get done?
Of course. Yeah.
But it's very
thing to get
expensive
cut.
to get it right and to keep up with the changes.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add a couple big things to this overarching conversation. And this is, if this is, let's call it your first time, or even your second time, right, building an application, there are things that can really set you off on the right foot that I've seen way too many people not have a handle on, that I just expected it to happen. Number one, if you are working with developers that don't work for your company and aren't paid W-2, make sure you own your code, right? If that code is being repoed in GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever, you should own that code. They should own that code, right?
Like you should have the credentials for GitHub.
That's what I
like,
mean.
Yeah, the whole deal.
That's right. When it comes to doing a proof of concept, that's fine. But as soon as you're ready to launch that first version of the application, there's a lot of power and a lot of time saved in having a production server and a staging server for not a lot of money if you're not pushing a lot of data through it, right? So in theory, what that is you have the live version of your website, okay? And then you have a staging version that when it's pushed to production, right, when it goes live, they are at parity, they are equal. But let's say you want to test some new features and how it's going to interact with your system. If you make all of your edits to the staging server, you can test it and then you merge it into master, or merge it into your production server that then your customers are going to use. But if you keep making edits and you only have one code, like data set, right, one server, that's where bugs come in, and it's exacerbated when your code's not tested, because then that's where you're like, oh, we test our own stuff. We just click through till we find things. Well, guess what? Those are all front-end bugs, right? You haven't even started to look at the back-end bugs, right, that you can't see, that you can't test.
All right, we have time for one more short question. If it's out there, it's over here. You win. Your hand was up first.
I'm wondering, if you're not very technical and you're looking for a shop to help you build an app, should you be looking at shops that work in your industry, shops that work with code? Like, what are you looking for to get set in the right path? And how many shops should you have bid on your project before you land on one?
Yeah, so the question was, if you're not very technical and you're looking for a shop to build your app, like basically how do you go about doing that, right? If I missed part of that, holler at me. I was, a while ago, the founders of a company called Cladwell. You guys know Cladwell? They're Cincinnati-based. Okay. Cladwell, they're a startup in Cincinnati, maybe 8 years old now. They were coming to me and asking that question when I was in IT leadership position, and they would come to me and they would ask me questions like, how do you do this? How do you lead a team? How do you figure this out? And I think at the time we were probably pointing them to places online, like Fiverr and places like that, to form a relationship with an engineer. But I was encouraging them to take somebody along who knew something about software engineering and basically have that person, have a friend help them sort out how to, like whether or not this person is qualified to do that work. Because the reality is, if you don't have the deep technical background, then you're probably not qualified to make that choice. You can qualify them on whether you like them and they might be good to work with, but me, for example, I won't let myself qualify somebody on their technical skills because I don't have the depth of technical skills to be able to make that choice. So I just literally don't make the choice. I know who I will call to answer those questions. So I think hanging out at places like this, meeting an engineer, making a friend out of them, and then going, hey, will you help me? And you don't have to give them $1 million to do that, right? You might have to buy them a beer, and they may sit down for a 1-hour interview with somebody. What's that? I don't know how many beers it takes for something like this. Don's got a high price. So anything you guys want to add to that?
Yeah, so I always liked when we were working in consulting that we always took a mindset of we wanted our clients to be as smart about their own technology as they wanted to be, right? We like to position ourselves as true stewards of other people's applications and to really treat it like it's our own. So when you're vetting other companies, search for those companies that are willing to teach you something about your own technology that aren't just trying to make a sale, right? That's probably the biggest thing. Another thing that I always thought was funny was people used to hire us based on our design chops. So we hired really good designers because we knew that we could market it. But we wanted them to use we made our money on the back end, right? Which is kind of an interesting way to go about it. And even still, people hire you because of your design chops, and they still want to like direct your mouse all over the keyboard, right? And so that's a really interesting thing as well, is understand what you're asking for. Like, what are you really asking for? And this comes from doing your own homework, right? So where I was talking about user stories, laying out some wireframes. They don't have to be pretty. No one expects you to do pretty stuff. The first wireframes I laid out was in Excel. And the development company that I went to didn't laugh at me, and that's why I chose them, right? Because I knew that they were willing to educate me along the way. and now I'm a UX designer, right? Like that's hilarious, right? But it's just through working through time and trial on this is how I can tell a better story. This is how I can bring in developers that I know can get the job done.
So that's it. We're getting cut off here.